The Wii U is a console whose history is already starting to be buried by both Nintendo and their fans. 2016 was the system's final year, and very little was released that caught anyone's attention. Today we're going to have a look at what some have considered to be the dying gasp of not just the Wii U, but one of Nintendo's many franchises. Let's talk about Star Fox Zero. Just in case you only know of Star Fox from being at Smash Bros., it's actually a series of space shooters made by Nintendo. The original game was released for the Super NES in 1993 and might just be one of the earliest console games to use 3D rendering technology. But it's not until 1997 that Star Fox 64 was released and became a classic for the era. This thing was my jam back in the day, and it offered a lot of variety. Finding all of the different routes wasn't a matter of choice. You had to really excel at the game. That gave it tremendous replay value for the time. But the 2000s are when Star Fox was its most prolific. There was Star Fox Adventures, but that doesn't really count for me. It was an unrelated rare adventure game that was reshaped to include Fox McCloud. But after that there was Assault, a proper new entry in the series made by Namco. I remember enjoying it, but it's much more linear than 64 and banks a little too much on being a ground-based third-person shooter instead. In 2006, you had Command, which was an interesting handheld take on Star Fox. Lots of different branching paths and aircraft to use, but ultimately a bit repetitive. And this game marked the end of the series' momentum outside of a 2011 re-release of Star Fox 64 for the 3DS. So Zero was the first new Star Fox game released after 10 years of dormancy. There was definitely an appetite for Star Fox, maybe not as much as bigger Nintendo franchises, but enough that Nintendo was willing to bring on a studio that might be able to help deliver. This game was co-developed by Platinum Studios after they'd worked with Nintendo to put a Star Fox minigame into Bayonetta 2 a few years earlier. Platinum had been on a real roll with their games and had plenty of experience working with Nintendo on Wii U games, so this seemed like a very exciting collaboration. Not only that, but Zero is the first game that Shigeru Miyamoto himself had taken up a directorial position for in 20 years. He's produced countless Nintendo projects, but he hadn't been credited for directing since Super Mario 64. That had to suggest that he was passionate about returning to Star Fox. When they were teasing Star Fox Zero, Nintendo demoed two other projects that seemed to be related. One of these was released alongside Zero as Star Fox Guard. While most copies of Zero include Guard, mine doesn't, so we won't be covering it in this video, as it is a separate game that doesn't have any traditional Star Fox gameplay. For whatever reason, I never actually got around to picking up Star Fox Zero when it came out. I must have been busy with something else at the time, but I can't remember. Eventually, I did get a used copy on the cheap, and it's been sitting on a shelf until now. I'm actually a really big fan of the Wii U, to be honest. It had a ton of games that I loved, and unpacking it to make this video was a real blast from the past. So let's get into Star Fox Zero. Zero intends to capture the feeling of Star Fox 64 more so than its sequels. You can clearly tell this from the visual style, which feels like an evolved form of that old aesthetic. But you could also say this about the sound design, and much of the incidental dialogue is taken straight from 64. A few of the English voice actors are even reprising their roles, and those that aren't are clearly taking influence from the earlier portrayals of their characters. I would say that the soundtrack is one area where things feel more modernized. You can hear some arranged motifs from the earlier games, but otherwise this music feels like a bold new direction. But just from playing the opening stage of Corneria, you will probably get hit with a wave of nostalgia. The music may be different, but much of the level's design is a clear callback to its equivalent stage in 64. They do shake things up as the end of the level is completely new, but after not playing a new Star Fox game for 15 years, this stage really brought me back. I think that I got goosebumps when you first entered all range mode. Seriously. But beyond that, the design of the levels is more or less new outside of the occasional callback. For instance, the level on Zone S also features searchlights that you should avoid, but they serve a different function, and otherwise it's a totally different stage. There's a fairly good mix of rail-based stages that deliver the classic shooting that you expect, and all-range missions that ramp up the challenge, whether they take place on planets or in space. The challenge level is pretty similar to the older games, but there are some tweaks. Gold rings don't increase your maximum health anymore, for example. You can't lose your wings in this game, but just taking 2 hits when you have the blue laser upgrade will cause you to lose it, so you're under a lot more pressure to play well if you've managed to obtain it. And if you enjoy going for the highest scores and earning medals, there's quite a bit here for you. Some medals might just be found as environmental secrets, while others are rewarded for pulling off something cool. Sharp thinking and flashy play are rewarded, which really adds to the arcade-like feel of things. Branching pathways are back as well, but they don't quite return in the same way. We'll get into that later, because it's time to talk about the biggest area where things are different, and the game's make or break feature, the new controls. This might be a bit hard to show visually because I don't have anything recording my gamepad screen, so bear with me. The Wii U Gamepad shows things from the perspective of the cockpit. Moving the R-wing doesn't move the targeting reticle nearly as much. You need to physically aim with the gamepad's gyroscope. This means that you have a dramatically wider firing range than in previous games. You can be flying in one direction and still be able to aim at something almost completely to the ship's sides. This isn't to say that you can't use the TV's perspective to aim. You might be able to get away with it during the on-rails sections, but you're missing out on a lot. Just because something is off of the TV doesn't mean you can't still shoot it with the gamepad. You might also be thinking that the TV isn't really doing that much in this game. During some of the all-range encounters, you might need to use it to get a different angle on the action, as there's no radar or compass that provides a reference as to where things are. You can hold ZL to force the TV camera to track enemies, which is the best way to reorient yourself. I don't find it ideal, as you have to hold the button down when it should have just been a toggle. Gamepad aiming is something that takes getting used to, but the very first thing that you do in this game is a tutorial that covers almost all of the bases. But there are a few options that might be important to some people. You can switch perspectives with the select button. I didn't really use this feature much, but there were a handful of times where it was advantageous. There's also an option to disable the gyro aiming unless you're firing, but this didn't really interest me. Most of what I just spoke about there might sound confusing, but you're given plenty of time with tutorials to adjust to the gyroscope if you need it. And I find experiencing Star Fox from the first-person perspective to be an interesting change of pace. I think that the greater range of movement and precision added a lot to the experience. That's not to say that Nintendo pulled this off perfectly. You can definitely have some issues with tunnel vision by looking at the gamepad so much. There's an indicator on the gamepad that will let you know if enemy ships are tailing you, but I felt there needed to be more HUD elements like this. Indicators letting you know that there are incoming projectiles from your blind spots would have also been nice to have, as well as an arrow that points towards whatever target is being tracked on the television. Issues mostly boil down to the differences in information that you'll get from each screen. Looking across both the gamepad and the TV frequently might be disorienting for some people, but there's really only 2 boss battles in the game that I felt require this, and they were definitely both intended to be challenging for that reason. Other than the motion aspect, the controls are fairly easy to get a handle on. The right stick covers functions such as the throttle and rolling pretty easily, but there is one big new addition to the arsenal. By pressing A, the R-Wing can transform into a ground-based walker mech. This concept originates from the prototype for the cancelled Star Fox 2, so it was exciting to see a walker appear properly. In the rail sections, I don't use it a whole lot because it's just a little slower and it won't work if you don't have ground beneath you, but it's good at finding secrets and has more or less the same offensive capabilities as the R-Wing. When in all-range mode, you can use the walker to really shake things up. This is also the only vehicle where the ZL target lock feature has an effect on the gamepad. It actually functions like a traditional lock-on, allowing you to easily strafe foes. This is invaluable during most bosses where the walker is utilized. In addition to the walker, the Landmaster tank returns for 2 stages later in the game. It's been given an enhanced cannon, so you can now lock on to multiple targets at once and fire missiles that arc. Somewhat ironically, this tank doesn't quite have the turret-style field of view that you would expect, even though it's certainly better than the field of view it would have had in the older games. When fighting bosses in all-range mode, you might have to reposition the Landmaster so that it's directly facing the enemy, which isn't really how tank battles are supposed to work. This wasn't a huge problem or anything, but I just found it kind of funny. That original decision to have a front-facing cannon finally bit the designers a little bit. You can also get a transformation into the Gravmaster, which lets you fly for a limited time. It adds some dimension to the fighting, but there's not really many opportunities to use it since there are so few Landmaster stages in the game compared to everything else. The other vehicle is brand new, a turbine aircraft called the Gyro Wing. This thing can shoot, but it's used more for puzzles than anything else. You deploy a little tethered robot that can fit into tight spaces, activate computer panels, and even act as a crane so you can drop bombs on enemies below. While it's definitely a big shift in gameplay, I kind of wish we got to see more of it. It controlled pretty well, and since you don't have to do a lot of shooting, you don't need to be looking at the gamepad as much. Despite being introduced early on, the Gyro Wing only appears for about a level and a half, and maybe that's for the best if more uses of it would have cut into R-Wing time. I imagine that some people really hate this thing because it's quite slow and it doesn't have much action to speak of. Make no mistake, this is absolutely an R-Wing focused game, which I think was a great idea. If the Walker and the other vehicles had been forced more than they were, it might have just gotten in the way of things. Gamepad aiming is already a big enough shift in the controls, so it was probably a good idea to keep the alternate vehicles and their playstyles as a sideshow. Now, let's get back to talking about routes and level progression. It seems like they tried to give us the older style, where good performance changes your course, but ended up settling more on a new system, where completing certain stages unlocks the possibility of different paths on later playthroughs. There's only one traditional fork at Sector Beta. Defeating the Starwolf Squadron quickly means that you can head on to Planet Fortuna and then Sector Omega. If you take too long to eliminate Starwolf, Peppy will be shot down. Then you must head to Titania, then Sector Gamma, then Ficina, before finally regrouping at Sector Omega. All other branches only become available once you've either completed specific stages or unlocked functionality for certain craft. For instance, completing Area 3 causes portals to appear in other levels, so the next time that you play Corneria, you can find an alternate path that leads to a different boss. I have to mention this thing briefly because it might have been the toughest boss in the whole game. You have to destroy all of the cannons on this platform, but the issue is that it sends out an EMP wave every few seconds. It's hard to know when the pulse is coming without looking at the TV, but you're still pressured to keep a good look on the gamepad so that you can take out the cannons while dodging their beam attacks. It's all pretty rough for a boss tied to the game's first stage. An easy fix for this would have been to have indicators on the gamepad that point out the cannons when they're locked on, or just have some dialogue that gives you a warning when the pulse is charging up. Anyways, beating this thing lets you use the portal to head directly to Area 3 or Zone S, but they're not quite the same levels as if you went normally from Sector Alpha onward. Area 3 is now an extremely short R-Wing stage with no boss battles or really anything special. You fly around for a few minutes and then it stops. Very anticlimactic given that this is an original location created for Zero that looks pretty cool. Zone S is the same level from the main route, but you don't have the Gyro Wing. You just need to use the Walker to complete any challenges that require hacking or entering small spaces. This just disappointed me. Finding a secret path and taking down a pretty tough boss gave me some lackluster filler stages instead of something tough and new. But to be fair, most of the other secret levels aren't so underwhelming, but that doesn't mean that they feel as interesting or polished as the main stages. For instance, all of these other levels take place in space, so designing them was likely much easier. Almost all of them are devoid of wingmen as well, so they feel a bit lonely. The lack of squadron support doesn't necessarily make them harder. Ultimately, many of them just feel like bonus stages. After completing every Starwolf fight, their members will start appearing in earlier stages just to taunt you. If you decide to follow them, you'll straight up abandon the stage you're on and engage them in a dogfight. There are 2 stages in the asteroid field where your goal is just to shoot down rocks and drones to protect the Great Fox. Since this is similar to the premise of Sector Gamma, it's not very impressive to have 2 more stages that are basically the same thing. The most unfortunate thing is that unlike in Star Fox 64, there is no alternate path to Venom itself. The finale from Sector Omega onward is always the same, no matter which path you take. The final stage never changes. There's no secret boss or anything like that. This contributes to the game feeling like it has less content than Star Fox 64. There aren't really proper routes, just the intended levels and then some quicker paths you could take if you wanted to save on time. I didn't feel satisfied discovering and completing these paths, just disappointed. I wouldn't be surprised if these small extra stages were added to Zero late in development just to try and help the game feel like it has more content. Something about it just feels that way to me, and there is an interview with Miyamoto where he suggested that this may have been the case. There are even some weird oddities or missed opportunities with the branching paths. Normally in Area 3, you switch from the R-Wing to the Gyro Wing to complete the level. Then you escape through a portal to Zone S. But after completing a later mission, the Walker gains the ability to hack computers, so you can actually speedrun Area 3 next time you play it by not bothering to get the Gyro Wing. So you would think that entering the portal at the end to Zone S would keep you in the R-Wing, but it doesn't. Fox is just magically in the Gyro Wing if you try this. For some reason, you can only do the R-Wing version of Zone S by fighting the alternate boss on Corneria instead, even though there's a perfectly logical framework for it to occur through this method. While we're talking about Zone S, I should also mention how, in the Gyro Wing version of this stage, you rescue Kat from the base. But even if you never did this stage, or the R-Wing version at all, she'll always show up in Sector Beta and Fortuna. Given that 64 accounted for allies following you across stages properly, this is just another disappointing little thing about how branching paths are handled. And it's worth pointing out that Fox mentions the portal on Area 3 if you find it on Corneria. He shouldn't have seen that yet. They basically acknowledge that you're traveling across space and time by going back to earlier missions, but it doesn't feel like they did it in a way that makes me think that I'm in on the joke. When playing the game in arcade mode, these routes can definitely help you save on time, as they're much shorter. But if you're not interested in speedrunning the game, then you don't really have much incentive to try these stages more than once. This does feed into another issue with replayability. Outside of collecting the medals in each stage, there isn't really a way to increase the challenge of the game. Unlike 64, there is no hard mode, which is a bit disappointing when you remember that Platinum is involved. In several of their games, hard mode is only accessible after beating the game once, and because of that, they're able to seriously remix encounters the second time around. I think that Zero could have definitely benefited from something like that, but unfortunately, there are no difficulty options of any kind. Even the rewards for earning those medals seem a bit lackluster. They mostly just get you some simplistic challenge levels, 2 of which do contain a buggy you can drive around, but these just aren't very interesting. Otherwise, you can earn some different R-Wings to pilot. Having the Super Nintendo R-Wing is a nice touch, but I just don't know if most people are going to want to put in the work to unlock these, especially since you can just scan your amiibo instead if you got them. It's also worth mentioning that this game does not continue the trend of having a weird multiplayer mode that probably isn't that fun, but you still end up getting a lot of mileage out of, like Star Fox 64 and Assault did. There is technically co-op, but it just spreads the R-Wing's movement and weapons across 2 controllers. I mean, that sounds like a real hard mode to me, but I'm just not interested. I understand that Star Fox should be short and sweet, but without that certain level of replayability, Zero is held back compared to the entries in the series that Nintendo was trying to evoke. And that's my main problem with it. A problem that would keep people away from a game like this being fully priced. However, from the way that I heard people talk about Star Fox Zero, I expected it to be a lot worse. I expected it to basically be Star Fox 64 with intrusive motion gimmicks. and while that's not totally inaccurate, I still found myself enjoying Zero quite a bit. The professional reviews weren't amazing, and some people had particularly negative remarks. I wanted to try to understand the problems of it better, so let's dive into that. This is all based on people I've spoken to and their opinions of the game. Overwhelmingly, people did not respond well to the motion controls that this game was built around. But I actually think that they were done fairly well, and honestly, people should have been used to them by 2016. Nintendo had been doing this for 10 years, and there is no indication that they're going to stop using motion controls anytime soon. To steal a quote from Joseph Anderson, I feel like a lot of the rejection of non-traditional control schemes is ultimately a case of, I don't like sushi. There are people out there who just aren't interested in playing a game that doesn't use a twin-stick controller or a mouse and keyboard. It's just not for them. But that doesn't mean that other people can't enjoy something like a Wii Remote or the Gamepad or even a VR headset. People do have preferences, and the choice of controller might be more subjective than judging other aspects of a game, like its monetary value or general stability. But as someone who's played many games with a fair amount of gyroscopic control, this is definitely not some crappy shovelware from the Wii era. These controls have a certain element of depth and nuance to them. People obviously tried to make them work. I would compare Star Fox Zero to Metroid Prime 3. The way that these series played was fairly well established, and the developers tried to preserve that playstyle while repurposing it for a motion-based controller. In my opinion, the idea of using the gamepad screen to represent the first-person perspective of a cockpit feels fairly natural. This isn't like using a Wii Remote to do a lot of waggle gimmicks that don't really feel like they make sense for the controller or what you're supposed to be using it for. This is one clear use of the technology that applies to everything that you do in the game. I've heard many people say that there should have been an option for a more traditional control scheme, and maybe that's true, even if it would have put you at a disadvantage the way the game is currently designed. But if this game did not have the brand new playstyle, in my opinion, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting. It would just be a straight reimagining of Star Fox 64 without any particularly bold idea or reason to exist. If the controls were more or less the same as the ones from 64, that wouldn't make up with other issues people had with Zero, such as the short length or the fact that there was basically no story progression from the past games. I will admit that it's very strange that Star Fox Zero is a reboot of 64, which in and of itself was a reinterpretation of the original Super Nintendo game. When most people see the word Zero in a video game title, they assume that it's going to be a prequel or something like that. I'm sure some Star Fox fans might have enjoyed a game where you play as Fox's father, but I'm sure that Fox himself probably had more than a few previous missions before Andross's invasion. Either premise would have been fine with me. But instead they went with another remake. This decision was likely made because it had been 10 years since Star Fox Command released, and that game tried to keep a pretty tight continuity despite having 9 different endings, some of which were jokes while others were very conclusive. Either way, none of them were ever confirmed to be canon. It's not wrong to think that rehashing the Andross invasion storyline for the 3rd, possibly 4th time, depending on how you look at it, is a bit uncreative. But it had been so long since the last Star Fox game, and I can understand wanting to start fresh, especially since I don't think the overarching story is that important to the success of these games. I don't think that people would suddenly like Zero if Crystal was in it, but everything else was the same. Either way, I'm willing to accept that this may have deterred some people from buying the game. It does outwardly appear to be very similar to 64, even if by the 3rd level things are starting to be shaken up a bit. Even if this game was a brave new direction for Star Fox as a whole, that definitely wouldn't have solved the problems that other people had with the control scheme, like I mentioned before. Playing as Marcus McCloud, or fighting some new threat that probably would have only been superficially different from Andross's army, would likely not have been enough to convince Gamepad skeptics to buy this game. The 2 major grievances that people shared with me about this game aren't symbiotic. Fixing one does nothing to the other. Ultimately, it's clear that Star Fox Zero wasn't very successful. It was released at a time when many had considered the Wii U to be totally done for. The Nintendo Switch would launch about 1 year later, and nobody was thinking about Star Fox. Everyone just wanted Breath of the Wild. Reception for this game might have been better if it hadn't been delayed out of 2015, but we'll never really know. Now, since this is a Wii U game, I know someone's going to ask me if I think that this will get ported to the Switch like so many other games. There's no doubt in my mind that Zero would sell better on this system. But since the Gamepad was relied upon heavily, that means some changes would need to be made. Here's my thoughts on them. Since the Switch had a handheld mode, I don't think that cockpit view would need to be overhauled. All I can ask for is a toggleable target lock and maybe some better HUD elements to show dangers at your flank. But since a lot of people will be playing the game on a TV with no gamepad to speak of, the third-person perspective needs to be beefed up a bit. The free-range aiming would probably go away in favor of movement that's more like an older Star Fox game, or you could use the right stick to aim the R-Wing lasers while the ship is facing a different direction. It's possible that that could work. They should also consider adding a radar or some other indicator to help with tracking targets all around you. This is a feature from past games that was dropped, and I'm sure would help some players. As far as the larger changes go, I would definitely be happy if they actually had a hard mode, something to provide more challenge to people who've already played the game on Wii U. But otherwise, the changes that I would make are just the little things. So that's Star Fox Zero. Not exactly an amazing game, but not as bad as I'd feared. I ran through arcade mode countless times, just waiting to see if I'd hit that point where things got boring or the controls started to lose their luster. But it never came. Zero doesn't feel like the kind of mistake that deserves to be shoved under the rug. If you can grab a cheap, used copy and you already have a Wii U, I think it's worth playing for yourself, but only if you're already a fan of the Gamepad or games like Star Fox in the first place. Otherwise, this might not interest you, and there are definitely other games I'd recommend first if you were trying to check out the Wii U library. Hell, I'd still recommend playing Star Fox 64 if you know nothing about the franchise. My big hope is that Zero is not the end of Star Fox as a franchise. The characters did appear in Ubisoft's Starlink as Switch-exclusive content. I haven't played that game, but it's been on my radar for some time. It could make for a fun follow-up video. As far as an actual Star Fox game, there doesn't appear to have been any real news in the 5 or so years since Zero's release. And while that might be disappointing, I'm not exactly heartbroken or angry. Many Nintendo fans assume that all of the franchises are on equal footing, but they just aren't. No Star Fox game ever sold anywhere as close to as well as 64 did. Zero especially seems to have been buried financially. As a brand, Star Fox may just not be that popular, or at the very least, it's significantly less successful than much of what Nintendo has been pushing in the last decade. That's just a general thing that people need to accept. The niches that you really enjoy may not be what sells well in the grand scheme of things. I accept that arcade-style flight games may not have a large market, and there are at least games like Ace Combat that help scratch this itch for me, so as long as the entire genre isn't dead, then I suppose things are okay. Otherwise, we'll all be huddled in a corner, playing Star Fox 64, trying to recapture the past until our consoles finally break. Thank you for watching. I apologize for some oddities in my footage. My capture card's a bit off, but it really did not like recording Wii U footage for some reason. I don't know why. Either way, it was cool to talk about something that wasn't Sony related. I think some people have gotten the impression that I'm just going to cover PlayStation games more than others. While I have said in the comments that it might be fun to explore games like Days Gone or Knack for the channel, I'm not trying to show favoritism to Sony. That's not my intention at all. That's also why I picked a game that doesn't really have any story to speak of. This is all gameplay, so I hope I did a good job keeping it focused on that. Let me know how I did. Let me know if there's other Nintendo games you want me to check out. I've probably played a lot of them, so I'll be revisiting them potentially. Either way, just let me know how things are doing, how you feel about Star Fox, and make sure to like and subscribe and do the YouTube crap, right? Have a good day, everybody. See you later.